In 2019, I moved into a quiet cul-de-sac in a small town outside of Nashville. It wasn't my dream home, but it was affordable. And after years of apartment living, I wanted something that felt like my own space. The neighborhood was typical suburban America: neatly cut lawns, mailboxes with painted house numbers, families who waved when you drove by, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. The house next door, though, was different. It wasn't falling apart or anything, it was just strange. The curtains were always drawn, the yard was overgrown, and the mailbox had no name, only the faded number 147. I asked my realtor about it before buying the place, and she said, "Oh, the neighbor? That's Mrs. Weaver. She's an older lady, lives alone, keeps to herself." That seemed harmless enough. Everyone has that one reclusive neighbor. For the first few weeks, I barely noticed her. I'd sometimes see her standing on her porch when I got home from work, thin, white-haired, wearing the same faded blue nightgown, even in broad daylight. She never waved or smiled, just watched. I'd nod politely, and she'd turn away before I reached my door. Then came the sounds. It started one Wednesday night around 11 p.m. I was watching TV when I heard what sounded like scratching on the wall separating my living room from hers. It was faint at first, like nails tapping rhythmically. I muted the TV, listened for a moment, then shrugged it off as maybe a raccoon or something, but it kept happening. Same slow, dragging pattern. When I knocked on the wall to see if it would stop, it did, for about 10 seconds. Then came 3 distinct knocks back, soft but deliberate. I remember sitting there, frozen. Maybe she heard me and was just being weird, I thought. I laughed it off, but the sound lingered in my head long after I went to bed. The next day I saw her again, Mrs. Weaver, standing in her window, staring out through the blinds directly at my house. The moment she realized I saw her, she let the blinds fall back into place. That evening, I went over to introduce myself, maybe clear the air. I knocked on her door. No answer. I called out, "Hi, it's your new neighbor from next door." Still nothing. Just when I was about to walk away, I heard faint movement from inside. Then her voice, low and thin, like someone trying not to be overheard, said, "You shouldn't be here after dark." The hair on my arms stood up. Sorry," I said awkwardly. "Just wanted to say hello." "Not after dark," she repeated. Then I heard a lock click from the inside. I walked home quickly, telling myself she was just old and paranoid. But I couldn't shake her tone. That night, I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside my bedroom window. Slow, crunching steps on gravel. I held my breath and peeked through the blinds. There was no one there, but my motion light flicked on, and for half a second I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the edge of the property line between our houses. It was tall and thin, completely still. The moment the light hit it, it disappeared. I didn't sleep much after that. Over the next few days, the scratching sounds returned, only now they came from different spots along the wall, like someone crawling behind it. And every time I knocked, I'd get 3 slow knocks back. One afternoon, I finally saw the mail carrier and asked him about Mrs. Weaver. He frowned. "She hasn't gotten mail in months. I stopped delivery after she didn't pick it up for a while." That didn't make sense. I'd seen her just days ago. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. Around 11, I heard the scratching again, louder this time, coming from right behind my couch. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, determined to prove it was some kind of animal. I walked around to the side of the house, but there was nothing. The grass was undisturbed. The night was silent, except for distant crickets. Then I noticed something about her house. Her living room window, the one that faced mine, had condensation on the inside, like heavy breathing had fogged it up. And through the thin curtains, I saw movement, a faint shadow shifting back and forth. "Mrs. Weaver?" I called out, stepping closer. No response. But then, from somewhere deep inside, I heard it, a soft, drawn-out moan. Not quite pain, not quite speech, just wrong. I went back home and called the non-emergency police line, telling them I was worried about my elderly neighbor. 2 officers came by within 20 minutes and went next door to check. They knocked several times, announced themselves, then eventually forced the door open. I waited in my driveway, anxious, expecting them to find her sick or hurt. After a few minutes, one of the officers came back out, his expression unreadable. "Sir," he said carefully, "how long did you say you've lived here?" "About a month," I replied. He glanced toward the open doorway, then back at me. There's no one living there, I frowned. What? That's impossible. I've seen her almost every day. He shook his head. House is empty. Hasn't been occupied in quite some time. I followed him to the door. The inside was covered in dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling corners. The smell of rot and mold hit me like a wall. Everything was old, newspapers from years ago, faded photos on the wall, furniture draped in sheets. See for yourself, the officer said quietly. I walked into the living room, flashlight beam sweeping across the space, and froze. On the far wall directly opposite mine, there were deep scratch marks gouged into the plaster. Dozens of them. Fingernail grooves, and above them, written in what looked like rust or old blood, were 3 words, "Not after dark." The officers swept the rest of the house. No sign of anyone. No Mrs. Weaver. But they did find something strange in the basement. The concrete floor had a large, uneven patch that looked newer than the rest, like someone had poured fresh cement not long ago. They didn't say much, but I could see the unease on their faces. The next morning, the landlord boarded the place up. He told me it had been vacant since the previous tenant, an older woman named Evelyn Weaver, had died there years ago. Alone. No relatives, no next of kin. The city never got around to cleaning out the property, so it just sat there. That broke something in me. I couldn't understand it. I saw her. I heard her voice. I heard the knocking. The landlord didn't want me spreading rumors around the neighborhood, so he said very little about what exactly happened to her. But one of the contractors who came to inspect the property later that week told me she'd been gone a while before anyone noticed, sat right in her chair by the wall. They only found her because someone complained about the smell. After that, the knocking stopped, completely. The smell that had faintly lingered around the shared wall vanished too. For a few months, things were quiet, peaceful even. I started to sleep better, convinced it was all my imagination. But one night, maybe 6 months after the police boarded her house up, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of tapping. 3 slow knocks, coming from the wall between our houses. I sat up, listening. My breath caught in my throat as I heard a voice, soft, raspy, unmistakable. You shouldn't be here after dark. The knocking grew louder, faster, and then it stopped just as suddenly. My porch light flickered on outside my bedroom window, and in that split second, I saw her standing there, the same pale face, the same blue nightgown, watching me. By the time I got the courage to move, she was gone. I moved out within a week. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing money. I packed everything I could fit in my truck and drove until I couldn't see that street anymore. That house next door still stands. It's been sold a few times since, I heard, but no one stays long. Every new owner says the same thing. That at night, when the wind is still, they hear scratching in the walls, and always, right before it stops, they hear 3 soft knocks. I've tried to convince myself I imagined it all, but sometimes, even now, when I wake in the dark and the house is completely quiet, I swear I can hear it again. 3 knocks, then a whisper. You shouldn't be here after dark. Story the end. It started out as a normal move-in day. I had just rented a small townhouse on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city. Quiet neighborhood, neat lawns, and a sense of suburban calm that seemed almost too perfect. I was 30, single, and working remotely, so I figured the isolation wouldn't be a problem. My neighbors seemed friendly enough during the quick walkthrough of the block. Waves, small hellos, and polite smiles. I noticed the house directly next door had a tall, dark fence, and the yard was almost entirely shaded by overgrown trees. The house itself looked older than the rest, paint peeling, windows dust-streaked, but it had an air of permanence, like whoever lived there had been around for decades. The first strange moment came the night I moved in. I was unpacking boxes, trying to find the right place for my kitchenware, when I heard a faint scratching. At first, I thought it was the cats from the neighbor's house, or maybe a branch hitting the siding. But the sound was too rhythmic, deliberate. It came from the side of the house closest to the neighbor. I ignored it, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just rodents. The neighborhood had those, after all. Over the next few days, small oddities kept cropping up. I would see fleeting shadows in the corner of my eye through the blinds, shapes that seemed human but vanished whenever I looked directly. At first, I chalked it up to imagination. Living alone does that to you. But it became more frequent. One evening around 8, I noticed the curtains on the neighbor's second floor window twitch. I hadn't even realized anyone had curtains, and I thought the house was empty. When I peered closer, I could swear I saw a figure standing just behind the glass, staring at my house. I blinked. The figure was gone. I tried to talk to my other neighbors about it. Most were kind but dismissive. Old houses do weird things, one lady said. You'll get used to it. Another man gave me a quick smile and muttered something about the previous owner, then quickly walked away. Nobody knew much about the house next door. Oddly, it seemed like nobody wanted to know. A week after moving in, things escalated. I had just finished dinner, sitting on my couch with the lights off, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a distinct knock. Not on my door. On the side of the house. My heart jumped. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a delivery or a prank, but then came another knock. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I got up and peered through the side window. Nothing. The yard was empty, but the air felt wrong. I got the uneasy sense that I wasn't supposed to look, yet I couldn't stop myself. Then I noticed footprints, barefoot, leading from the fence back into the neighbor's yard. I live in a quiet street. Nobody goes wandering around at night. I tried calling the police, but the dispatcher told me to just lock my doors and keep an eye out. They said they didn't have the resources to check every quiet street for unknown trespassers unless there was a direct threat. So I did what any rational person would do. I stayed awake that night, watching the dark outline of the house next door. The wind moved the trees, the shadows shifted, and I convinced myself it was all in my head. Until I saw a light flick on in the second floor window. It wasn't a normal light. It was small, low, almost like a candle. But the thing that froze me was that the light wasn't moving toward a window. It was moving toward me. The figure appeared again, pale, motionless, staring straight at me through the glass. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then it disappeared. Just like that. Sleep deprived, I started noticing patterns. The movements were never random. It always happened at night, and only when I was home alone. I checked with the neighbors during the day, but nobody ever saw anything. The house next door seemed abandoned in the daylight, almost decayed, yet at night it was alive. I began leaving my lights on all night, hoping the brightness would deter whoever or whatever was there. It didn't help. Then came the sounds. Scratching and tapping, sometimes soft, sometimes loud enough to make me flinch. It sounded like someone pacing the floors, moving furniture, dragging something heavy. It always started around 11, grew louder around 1, and stopped just before sunrise. One night, I swore I heard whispering, words I couldn't understand, but definitely human. I stayed awake, listening. My phone recorded nothing. I considered moving out. I even packed a bag and went to a hotel for a night to test if I was imagining it. The hotel was silent, peaceful. I thought about never coming back, but my lease was locked in and my work required the setup I had at home. So I stayed, and it continued. One day, I got bold. I decided to knock on the neighbor's door, politely, to see if anyone actually lived there. The door was locked. No answer. I knocked again. No sound came back, only the hollow echo of my own fists. I tried the door handle. It turned. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The air was cold, musty, thick with dust. Everything was covered in sheets, old furniture, books piled in corners. It looked like a house frozen in time, untouched for years. But then I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise from upstairs. I froze. My stomach clenched. Slowly, I crept up the stairs. They creaked under my weight. Halfway up, the noise stopped. I reached the top and found the hallway empty. Every door was closed, all covered in dust, nothing disturbed. Then I saw it. On the wall at the end of the hallway, a small, framed photograph leaned crooked. A family picture. Smiling faces, dated 20 years ago. But something was off. The house in the picture was my townhouse. My house. And the figures? They were me. Only younger. And standing behind me in the doorway was the shadowed figure I had been seeing at night. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and nearly fell down the stairs. I ran outside and slammed the door shut behind me. My rational mind screamed that it was some kind of prank, some setup by previous tenants, but every logical explanation crumbled when I looked at the window above the front door. The second floor window of that hallway, the window I had been watching all these nights, the shadow was there, staring. I called the police again. This time they came, and we searched the house. Nothing. No sign of anyone having lived there recently. The house was empty. Every trace of life erased. They told me it was probably squatters, or that I might be suffering from stress, paranoia, or some form of sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations. I didn't sleep for 2 nights straight after that. Then the mail started arriving. Not mine. Letters, packages, addressed to me, but from years in the past. Bills, notices, postcards I had never seen before, some from places I had never been. Every envelope had the same handwriting, messy, almost childlike, and always signed with the same initials. I didn't recognize them, but the letters referred to events in my life that hadn't happened yet, or that had happened in ways I didn't recall. I installed cameras around my property, hoping to catch some evidence. Footage showed nothing at first, just the quiet, empty yard, leaves rustling. But then at night, the cameras captured shadows, long, thin figures moving between my house and the neighbors. Sometimes they'd pause at my window, bending slightly as if peering in. Sometimes they'd disappear into the darkness of the trees or the fence line. No one was ever clearly visible, just shapes. The final tipping point came about a month after I moved in. I woke to the sound of a key turning in my front door. I live alone. No one had a key. My phone was dead. I froze, listening. The door clicked open. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the living room. There was no one. Nothing. But the smell hit me. Damp, decayed, like wet soil mixed with rust. The smell of something dead. I left the house for hours, walking the streets, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. When I returned, my front door was wide open. Inside, all the furniture was shifted. My boxes had been rifled through, and on the living room wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "I'm next door." I moved out the very next day. I didn't pack slowly. I didn't linger. I left every single item I didn't absolutely need, and I didn't look back. The house was empty when I left, but I swear I saw a figure in the upstairs window, watching me go. No curtains, no reflection, just the dark silhouette standing still, watching. I never returned to that street. I don't even drive past it. Friends asked if I ever contacted the authorities after moving. I didn't. There was no proof, no evidence that wouldn't get laughed at or dismissed. The letters stopped arriving after I moved, but every so often, late at night, I see shadows out of the corner of my eye in places they shouldn't be. I sometimes catch a glimpse of that same pale figure, and I feel it, the way I felt all those nights. Eyes on me, patient, knowing, watching from just next door. I keep telling myself I'm safe now, but there's a part of me that wonders if it ever really leaves. If you're not careful, if you live too close to the wrong house, you realize that sometimes horror isn't about monsters in the woods or ghosts in old mansions. Sometimes it's right next door, and it waits. Quiet, patient, watching. I don't know who or what lived there before. I don't know if it was human. I don't know why it chose to make my life a nightmare. But I do know this. People can look normal. Houses can look abandoned. Shadows can look innocent. But when you start seeing patterns, when the scratches turn into knocks, when the lights move on their own and the whispers follow you, you understand one thing clearly. It's not just paranoia. It's real. And sometimes you just get unlucky enough to be the one it notices. Story the end. When I first moved into the duplex on 8th Avenue in Spokane, Washington, it seemed like a good deal. Rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was quiet, and the place had been freshly renovated, or so the landlord said. It was a small 2-bedroom unit, half of a single-story house that was split right down the middle. The other side was occupied by a woman named Claire, though I didn't meet her for nearly a week after moving in. I worked late nights as a mechanic at a shop across town, so I usually got home around 1 or 2 in the morning. The first few nights, I noticed something odd, a light always on in Claire's half of the duplex. Her living room window faced mine, separated by a narrow driveway, and every night when I got home, the lamp near her window glowed faintly yellow. I figured she worked odd hours like me, or just liked to keep a light on. The first time I actually saw her, it was a Sunday morning. I was unloading groceries from my truck when she came out her front door. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, thin, pale, with long dark hair that didn't quite match her light eyebrows. She wore a loose gray sweater and jeans that hung off her like she'd lost weight recently. She gave me a polite smile but didn't come closer. "You must be the new guy," she said in a soft voice. "Yeah," I replied, smiling back. "Just moved in last week. I'm Evan." She nodded. "Claire, welcome to the neighborhood." Her tone was kind, but something about her eyes seemed distracted. She looked past me toward my side of the duplex for a second before she spoke again. "If you ever hear anything weird at night, don't worry. The walls are thin and the plumbing makes noise sometimes." "Good to know," I said, trying to sound casual. "Old pipes?" She nodded again, then gave a small wave and went back inside. It was an ordinary enough exchange, but as the days passed, I began to notice little things that unsettled me. Sometimes, when I came home late, I'd see shadows moving behind her curtains, like someone pacing back and forth. Other times, I'd hear faint thumping sounds through the shared wall that separated our bedrooms. Once, around 3 a.m., I even thought I heard whispering. The strange thing was, it didn't sound like a conversation. It was more like one voice, hers, talking softly, then stopping abruptly, like she'd realized she was being overheard. I brushed it off for a while. Maybe she had trouble sleeping. Maybe she talked to herself. But then things started to feel different. One night, I got home later than usual, close to 3:30. As I parked my truck, I noticed her light was still on, but this time she was standing by the window. I could see her silhouette clearly. She was facing the glass, not moving. I almost waved, but decided against it. Something about how still she was made me uneasy. When I got inside, I glanced out my own window. Her light had gone out. The next morning, I went to take out the trash and noticed a small pile of something on my front step. Feathers. Black feathers, maybe from a crow or pigeon, arranged in a rough circle. I crouched to look closer, but didn't touch them. It wasn't windy that morning, and the rest of the yard was clean. I looked toward Claire's door, but it was closed. That afternoon, I asked my landlord, Mr. Hensley, if he knew anything about her. He raised an eyebrow. "Claire? She's quiet. Pays rent on time. Been there about 6 years now. Keeps to herself mostly." "Ever had any problems with her?" I asked. He hesitated a moment before answering. "Not really, though the last tenant in your unit, he complained about hearing things through the wall. Said she was doing some kind of rituals or something. He broke the lease early, but personally, I never had an issue with her." He said it like he didn't believe any of it, but something in his voice suggested he didn't want to talk more. That night, I couldn't shake the thought of the feathers. I finally decided to sweep them into a dustpan and toss them in the garbage can out back. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed Claire watching me from her kitchen window. The light behind her was dim, but I could make out her expression, blank, like she wasn't really seeing me. I gave a nervous wave, but she didn't move. For the next few days, things quieted down. I started to think I was overreacting. Until one Thursday night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint knocking. It wasn't on my door. It was on the wall. 3 slow knocks. I froze. Then 3 more. It came from the wall behind my bed, the one that separated my room from hers. "Claire?" I called out, unsure why I even said it. No answer. I waited for a few seconds, heart pounding, then got up and pressed my ear to the wall. I could hear something, soft, like breathing. Then, just barely audible, I heard her voice. "Don't answer it." I stumbled back, confused and terrified. The knocking stopped. For the rest of the night, I sat on my couch with the lights on, trying to make sense of what she said. Don't answer what? The next morning, I tried to catch her before I left for work, but her blinds were shut and her car was gone. That evening, I knocked on her door. No response. The day after that, I saw her out front, watering her small patch of grass. I hesitated before walking over. "Hey, Claire," I said. "You, knocked on my wall the other night?" She stopped, looked at me with an unreadable expression, then slowly shook her head. "No, I don't knock." I chuckled awkwardly. "Well, someone did, from your side of the wall." She set down the watering can. "It wasn't me." Then she added quietly, "Sometimes it's not me over there." I didn't know what to say. She turned and went back inside without another word. That night, I hardly slept. Around midnight, the knocks started again. This time it was softer, rhythmic, like tapping fingers. Then, after a few moments of silence, I heard my name, Evan. It was her voice, but it came from the wall, like she was standing right on the other side, whispering through the plaster. I didn't answer. "Evan," she said again, "don't open the door." I froze, staring at my front door. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock coming from outside. I stayed perfectly still. The knocks continued. 3 times, a pause, then 3 more. Who the hell knocks on someone's door at 2 in the morning? I crept toward the peephole. No one was there. The knocking stopped. The next day, I told myself I was done with this place. I called the landlord and told him I wanted to move out by the end of the month. He sounded annoyed, but agreed. That night, I started packing boxes. Around 10, I heard Claire's front door open and close. I peeked through the blinds and saw her walking toward the woods at the end of the street. She was carrying something in her arms, a bundle wrapped in a blanket. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. About 30 minutes later, she came back without the bundle. The following day, a police car showed up on our street. I stepped outside to see what was happening. 2 officers were knocking on her door. After a few minutes, one of them came over to me. "Sir, do you know your neighbor, Claire Whitman?" "Yeah, kind of," I said. "Why?" "She was reported missing by a coworker. Said she hasn't been to work in over a week." I blinked. "What? I saw her last night." The officer frowned. "Are you sure about that?" "Positive," I said. "She walked into the woods behind the houses, carrying something." They exchanged a look and asked me to show them. I led them to the path behind our duplexes. About 50 yards in, we found a small clearing. In the middle of it was a shallow hole covered loosely with branches and dirt. When they uncovered it, the smell hit first, rotting flesh. But what was buried there wasn't a human body. It was a large black bird, twisted and broken surrounded by small stones arranged in a circle. One of the officers muttered something about animal remains and took photos. They searched the rest of the area but didn't find Claire. That night, I didn't sleep. At around 3 a.m., the knocking came again. This time it was louder, angrier. I shouted, "Claire, stop it!" But the knocking didn't stop. It moved, across the wall, down toward the floor, then to the front door. I ran to the peephole again. No one was there. Then I heard the voice again. "Don't open it, Evan." Her voice was coming from the shared wall again, but her side was dark. I could see through her window now, and there were no lights, no movement. I backed away slowly. Then, from outside, came a new sound. Heavy footsteps on the gravel driveway. They stopped right outside my door. The handle turned slightly. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and called 911. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, no one was outside. They checked Claire's unit, locked from the inside. They had to break in. It was empty. No furniture, no dishes, nothing. Just bare walls and dust. The officer looked puzzled. "You said she's been living here?" "Yeah, for years," I said. "I saw her almost every day, but there was no sign anyone had lived there for a long time." A few days later, I talked to the landlord again. He looked shaken. "Evan," he said slowly, "Claire moved out last year. She just disappeared. Never paid her last month's rent. I've been trying to re-rent that unit, but no one's wanted it." I stared at him, completely numb. "Then who was living there?" He shook his head. "I don't know, but it's been empty since 2023. I moved out that same week. A month later, I got a call from one of the officers who'd investigated the missing person report. They'd finally traced a connection. Apparently, a woman named Claire Whitman had gone missing 6 years ago. Her remains were found in the same woods behind that duplex. The official cause of death was undetermined. Sometimes late at night, when I'm half asleep, I still hear knocking, slow and steady, and a faint voice, barely audible, whispering, "Don't open the door." Story, the end. When I first moved into the duplex on Maple Ridge Lane, I thought I'd lucked out. The rent was reasonable, the street quiet, and my neighbors, at least on one side, seemed polite. It was a small town in Ohio, just far enough from the city that you could still hear crickets at night. I was 28, recently divorced, and ready for a reset. The place next door had been empty for months, according to the landlord, so I figured I'd have some peace. For the first couple of weeks, that's exactly what I got. Then, one night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps in the shared wall between my bedroom and the empty unit next door. I froze, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I sat up and checked my phone. 3:12 a.m. I tried to brush it off as an animal in the walls or the sound of the house settling, but the footsteps were too rhythmic. When they stopped, I lay there for a long time, my heart racing, waiting for them to start again. They didn't. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the property. The unit next door looked deserted, windows covered in grime, curtains drawn tight. The front steps were covered in leaves. I tried the doorknob out of curiosity, but it was locked. I told myself I'd been dreaming. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, I was in the living room, reading, when I heard a faint dragging noise from the other side of the wall, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, then a low thump. I muted the TV. The sound came again. Drag, thump, drag, thump. I went to the wall and pressed my ear against it. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by complete silence. I knocked on the wall. "Hello?" I said, half laughing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. No response. For the next week, I kept hearing odd noises, creaks, faint whispers, scratching. One morning, when I left for work, I noticed something strange. The mailbox for the empty unit was open. Inside was a single envelope, damp and yellowed, with no return address. The handwriting was jagged, slanted. It was addressed simply to the one who moved in next. My stomach turned as I held it. I looked around. No one was outside. I slid the letter into my pocket and drove to work, trying not to think about it. That evening, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper written in the same shaky handwriting. It said, "Don't stay after dark. He doesn't like the noise." That night, I kept every light on in the house. The air felt different, heavy, expectant. Every shadow in the corners seemed darker. I didn't hear any noises for a while, but around 2 a.m. my kitchen light flickered, then went out completely. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the breaker, which was fine. Then came the noise again, the dragging. But this time, it wasn't through the wall. It was above me. Someone was in the attic. I froze under the sound. I could hear the faint scuff of movement across the ceiling, slow, careful. My throat went dry. I backed toward the door and called the landlord, whispering that someone was in the attic. He sounded half asleep and irritated. "That attic's sealed," he said. "No one's been up there in years." I didn't sleep that night. The next day when I got home, there were muddy footprints leading from the side of my house to the space between mine and the next unit. Barefoot prints, too large to be mine. I called the police this time. 2 officers came, did a brief check, and said the unit next door was empty, no signs of forced entry. They looked at the attic hatch and told me there was no access between the 2 units. They were polite, but clearly skeptical. But the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. The footsteps became heavier. The dragging sounded closer. Some nights I'd wake up to what sounded like breathing through the vent. It wasn't my own. It was deeper, slower, as if someone was lying on the other side of the vent grate, listening. One evening, my curiosity got the better of me. I borrowed a ladder from work and decided to peek into the attic myself. The hatch was painted over, but after some effort, I pried it open. A foul, musty odor hit me immediately, something rotten mixed with mildew. I shone my flashlight into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but insulation and beams. Then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was small, a shape, crouched low. I couldn't tell what it was. My brain refused to register it. The instant my flashlight caught it, it scrambled deeper into the darkness, fast like an animal. But I heard the sound it made as it moved. It wasn't an animal. It was breathing. I slammed the hatch shut, climbed down, and nailed it closed. The next morning, I called the landlord again and told him what I'd seen. He sighed and said, "Look, there's no one living in that attic. The last tenant next door moved out months ago. She said she was hearing things too. You're letting it get to you." When I asked about the previous tenant, he grew quiet. "She left in a hurry," he said finally. Didn't say much, just left a note saying she wouldn't come back. That night, I packed a bag and stayed at a friend's apartment across town. I didn't tell her much, just that the place was weird. But when I went back the next morning, something was different. The front door was unlocked, even though I was sure I'd locked it. Inside, the air was freezing, and the smell was stronger. Decay, like something dead trapped in the walls. I found the source when I stepped into my bedroom. The wall between my room and the next door's unit had a new crack running along it, thin but jagged, like it had been hit from the other side. I touched it. The drywall was warm. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I stayed up, sitting in the living room with all the lights off, just waiting. Around 3 a.m., the dragging started again. I could hear it move along the wall, closer to where I sat. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. For a split second, I saw movement through the blinds, someone standing in the narrow gap between the houses. A tall, thin figure, completely still, its face hidden in shadow. I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. The figure was gone. But when I looked closer, I saw something on the glass. Smudges. Handprints. On the inside. The next morning, the landlord called me unexpectedly. "I got your voicemail," he said nervously. "Listen, I should probably tell you something about that unit next door." He explained that years ago, before the duplex was split into two, an older man had lived there with his wife. The wife disappeared one night. The police searched the property but found nothing. The husband told everyone she'd left him, then vanished a few months later. The property sat empty for years until it was remodeled, but the attic, he said, had never been redone. Too unstable, he called it. He tried to sound reassuring, but I could hear something in his voice. Fear or guilt. That night I heard it again. The footsteps above me, the breathing through the vent. I turned on the lights, grabbed my phone, and started recording. I wanted proof. The recording caught everything. The faint sound of dragging, the whispering, and then something else. A voice. A man's voice, low and hoarse, saying, "She's still here." I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I went to the police with the recording. They agreed to check the attic again, this time with me there. When they opened it, the stench was unbearable. A few minutes later, one of the officers shouted for the other. I climbed the ladder behind them and saw it. Nestled between the beams, covered in dust and insulation, was an old trunk. Inside were bones, human bones. They sealed off both units that afternoon. The forensic team said the remains had been there for years, possibly decades. They couldn't immediately identify them, but based on old missing persons reports, they suspected that they belonged to the wife who had disappeared. The husband was never found. I moved out the same week. I didn't go back for my things. I couldn't. Even now, in my new apartment, I still wake up sometimes to faint sounds in the walls. Soft footsteps, the occasional dragging noise. My therapist says it's trauma, that my mind's replaying it. But sometimes when I lie awake, I could swear I hear a whisper coming through the vent. She's still here. Story the end. When I moved into my new place in Grand Junction, Colorado, I thought I'd finally found peace. After years of moving from apartment to apartment, this quiet little house on a suburban street felt like a dream. It was small but cozy. 2 bedrooms, a yard with a swing set left behind by the last family, and neighbors who seemed polite enough. The man next door, in particular, seemed almost too friendly at first. His name was Martin. Martin lived alone in the house to my right. He was in his mid-50s, maybe older, tall and thin, with deep wrinkles and pale blue eyes that didn't seem to blink enough. He always wore the same flannel jacket, no matter the weather, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. The first time we met, he came over while I was unloading boxes from my car. "Welcome to the block," he said, voice soft but gravelly. "You'll like it here. We don't get many new faces." He helped me carry a few boxes inside and even offered to mow my lawn just to keep things tidy. I thanked him, thinking he was just being neighborly. But over the next few weeks, he seemed to appear constantly. In his yard, by his fence, even standing in his driveway at night staring toward my house. At first, I brushed it off as harmless. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he just didn't know how to interact with people anymore. But the longer I lived there, the more I realized something wasn't right with Martin. It started with the noises. About 2 weeks after I moved in, I began hearing thumping sounds late at night, deep, hollow knocks that seemed to come from inside the walls. At first, I thought it was the house settling or maybe raccoons under the porch. But one night when I followed the sound, it led me straight to the shared wall between my house and 3 slow knocks. Then silence. I knocked back, lightly, half joking. Almost immediately, I heard 3 more knocks in response. It was too deliberate to be coincidence. The next morning, when I went outside to get the mail, Martin was already standing by the fence, smiling that unsettling, too wide smile. "Sleep well?" he asked. I hesitated. Not really. I kept hearing noises. He tilted his head slightly. "Sometimes the house talks back. You just have to ignore it." Then he turned and walked away before I could respond. After that, the knocking became almost nightly. Sometimes it sounded like tapping from the walls, other times scraping beneath the floorboards. One night, I heard it coming from the ceiling, like someone crawling through the attic. I tried to reason with myself. Old houses make sounds, rodents, wind, but deep down, I knew better. A week later, I was in my backyard at dusk, watering the plants, when I noticed something strange about Martin's house. The curtains were drawn as usual, but through a small tear in one, I saw movement, a shadow pacing back and forth, then another. There were two people inside, but as far as I knew, Martin lived alone. Later that night, as I sat in the living room watching TV, I heard footsteps on my porch. I froze. The steps were slow, heavy, and deliberate. Then someone tried the doorknob. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could, a soft voice came through the door. "Hey there," Martin said. "You left your light on out back. Just looking out for you." I didn't answer. I just waited, silent, until the footsteps retreated. When I looked out the peephole, he was still standing on my porch, staring at the door, his face too close to the glass. The next morning, there was a small gift bag sitting on my porch. Inside was a dead bird, perfectly preserved, wings neatly folded, no note. I started locking every door, every window, double-checking the locks before bed. I even installed cameras, one at the front door, one out back. But that didn't stop it. The next night, I got a motion alert on my phone around 2 a.m. I opened the app and saw Martin standing in my backyard, just inside the camera's view. He was holding something, a small black garbage bag, and digging a hole near my fence line. I called the police immediately. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They searched his yard but found nothing. The officer told me to call again if I saw him trespassing. The following evening, Martin came over as if nothing had happened. "Didn't mean to scare you last night," he said casually, leaning on the fence. "Had to bury something before it started to stink." "What was it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled. "A raccoon, or what was left of it." Then he winked and went back inside. That was the moment I decided to start looking into him. I did a quick search online and found almost nothing. No social media, no public photos, not even a record of him owning the house. I called the county office and the woman there told me something strange. According to the property records, the house next door hadn't been officially owned by anyone since 1997. "But someone's living there," I said. She hesitated. "That's not possible. That property's been marked condemned since the fire." I froze. "What fire?" She told me that in 1997, a man named Martin Langley had owned that property. There had been a house fire that killed his wife and teenage daughter. The house was supposedly uninhabitable afterward. She said no one was ever arrested, but there had been suspicions. I hung up, heart pounding, and stared out the window toward his house. It looked perfectly intact. Old, yes, but not burned. That night, the knocking in the walls came back, louder than ever. But this time, there was another sound underneath it, a low, guttural sobbing. I ran to the wall and pressed my ear against it. The sobbing turned into whispering. Two voices, a man's and a woman's, speaking softly, too muffled to make out the words. Then, suddenly, a loud bang rattled the wall. I jumped back. The next morning, I walked over to his yard, determined to confront him once and for all. His curtains were still drawn, but when I knocked, the door creaked open by itself. "Martin?" I called out. No answer. The air inside smelled like rot and old smoke. The floors creaked beneath me as I stepped inside. Furniture covered in sheets, dust so thick it looked untouched for years. Then I noticed something. The photos on the mantel. They were all burned around the edges. In every one, the same man stood smiling beside a woman and a teenage girl. Martin, but in some of the photos he looked much younger, maybe 30 years younger, and yet the face was identical. As I turned toward the back of the house, I heard movement, slow, dragging footsteps coming from the basement. "Martin?" I said again. No answer. Against my better judgment, I pulled open the basement door. The smell hit me immediately, something foul and earthy, like decayed meat. I took one step down, shining my phone's flashlight into the darkness. What I saw made my stomach drop. The basement was filled with dozens of old mannequins, all dressed in tattered clothing, wigs hanging off their heads. Their faces were smeared with soot, and in the center of the room was a large table with two shapes under white sheets. I turned and ran. I called the police again and told them everything. When they searched the house, they confirmed what I'd seen, except they also found something I hadn't. Behind the mannequins was a hidden doorway leading to a narrow tunnel that ran directly beneath my fence. When they followed it, it came up in my crawl space. They never found Martin, not a trace of him, his fingerprints, his clothes, even the ashes in the fireplace, nothing. But they did find something else buried in his yard. 2 bodies. One adult female, one teenage girl. Both had been there for decades. The coroner estimated they'd been dead since the late 90s, the same year of the fire. The police told me the house had likely been illegally rebuilt years later by someone else, but whoever was living there now had disappeared. They couldn't explain the noises, the knocking, or how Martin had appeared so real. I moved out a few weeks later, but on my last night in that house, as I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, I heard it one last time, 3 slow knocks on the wall, and then, faintly, a man's voice whispered, "Welcome to the neighborhood." Story the end. I bought the house on Meadowbrook Lane in the fall of 2019 after years of apartment living and bad landlords. It was in a small, quiet neighborhood just outside Madison, Wisconsin. The kind of place where every lawn was neatly trimmed, every mailbox freshly painted, and every neighbor waved as they passed. The house was perfect for me. 2 bedrooms, a small fenced yard, a porch swing, and just enough character to feel lived in. My real estate agent, Janet, mentioned that the house next door had been vacant for about a year. She said the previous tenant left suddenly and didn't leave much of an explanation. I didn't think much of it. In fact, I liked the idea of peace and quiet. For the first few weeks, everything was ideal. I worked remotely, spent evenings cooking, and occasionally walked around the block to get to know the neighborhood. Everyone was friendly enough, though a little cautious. I noticed that whenever the vacant house next door came up, people would quickly change the subject. It wasn't until early November that I realized someone had moved in. I first noticed the light, dim, yellow, flickering faintly from the window on the second floor of the blue-gray house next to mine. It was a cold night around 11:30 p.m., and I'd gone out back to take the trash to the bin. When I looked over, the light went out. I thought maybe it had been a reflection or a timer light. But the next night, it was on again. Same window, same dim flicker. 2 days later, I saw a man moving boxes through the front door. Mid-40s, maybe early 50s, wiry build, pale complexion. He wore an old brown jacket and a baseball cap that looked faded from years of use. When he noticed me watching, he gave me a small, polite nod. I waved back and went inside. I didn't see him for the rest of the week, but I knew he was there. I'd hear faint noises from his house, footsteps pacing slowly, the occasional creak of floorboards, sometimes muffled voices, though no one else ever seemed to come or go. One night I heard knocking. It was soft at first, almost like someone testing the door. I checked the clock, 2:48 a.m. I froze in bed, listening. Knock, knock, knock. I got up quietly, walked to the living room, and looked through the peephole. Nobody there. When I turned on the porch light, I caught something, a shadow moving quickly across my yard toward the side fence. The next morning, there were wet footprints on the porch. Bare footprints. I tried to convince myself it was kids or maybe even an animal, though I knew deep down that that wasn't right. The prints were human, long, narrow, slightly uneven, like the person had a limp. A few days later, I saw him again, my new neighbor. He was standing at his mailbox when I came out to grab mine. I waved. He smiled faintly, revealing teeth that looked wrong. Too many of them showing, like his grin stretched too wide. "Hey there," I said. "I'm Daniel. I live next door." He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, then said, "You've been here a while, haven't you?" "Yeah, a couple months. You just move in?" He tilted his head, like he didn't quite understand the question. "I've always been here," he said quietly. Then he turned and went back inside. That sentence rattled me. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he meant he'd lived in town before. Maybe it was a weird joke. But something in his tone didn't sound like a joke. That night, I woke up again to noise. This time, it wasn't knocking. It was whispering. Soft, rhythmic whispering, coming from the direction of my bedroom window. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. It almost sounded like someone was standing right outside, murmuring in a low, distorted voice. I grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the window. The moment I shined it outside, the whispering stopped. Nothing there. The yard was still. But the next morning, when I checked, there were footprints again, this time right beneath my bedroom window. I started keeping my blinds shut after that. About a week later, I came home from the grocery store to find my back gate wide open. I always kept it latched, and I was sure I'd locked it that morning. My stomach dropped as I walked into the yard. On the back step, there was something sitting neatly in the center of the doormat, a photograph. It was old and slightly curled at the edges. When I looked closer, my breath caught. It was a photo of my house, my living room, specifically, taken from the outside through the window. I could see myself sitting on the couch watching TV. That night, I called the police. 2 officers came by, took my statement, and checked the property. They found nothing. They asked if I had any security cameras. I didn't, but I bought one the next day. For a few nights, nothing happened. Then, one morning, I checked the footage. At 3:12 a.m., the camera caught movement, someone walking along the side of my house. The figure stopped right in front of the lens, staring directly into it. The flashlight beam reflected off his eyes, making them look pale and glassy. It was my neighbor. He leaned closer to the camera and his mouth moved. When I turned up the volume, I could just make out the whisper. "You should have stayed inside." I sent the footage to the police. They said they'd look into it. But when they went next door, the house was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no belongings. The electricity wasn't even connected. The officer, a stocky man named Benson, showed me the inside. The air was thick with dust, cobwebs hanging from the corners, old stains on the wallpaper. "Place looks like no one's lived here for years," he said. I told him that couldn't be true. I'd seen him. I'd spoken to him. I'd seen lights on. Benson gave me a sympathetic look, but I could tell he didn't believe me. That night, I double-locked every door and window. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the faint hum of static. My TV was on, though I was sure I'd turned it off. The screen showed nothing but white noise. As I stood there staring, the image began to shift, distorted shapes forming against the static, like something pressing against the inside of the glass. Then, for just a moment, the picture cleared. It was my living room. The exact angle I was standing in, only I wasn't alone. In the reflection, behind me stood the man from next door. I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. I moved out a week later. I didn't even bother packing everything. I just left. A few months later, curiosity got the better of me. I called a realtor to ask if the house next door had been sold again. She said it was still listed as vacant. When I mentioned the man I'd seen living there, she went quiet. Finally, she said that house has been empty since 2016. The man who owned it, he died inside, alone. His name was Walter Price. Some say he still walks the property. I hung up. I didn't want to know more. Now, every so often, around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzes with a notification from my old security app. Motion detected. It's always the same frame, the side of the house, my old yard, and a figure standing near the fence. Sometimes he's looking toward the camera, sometimes toward my window. Always watching. Story the end. When I first moved into my new place in 2021, it felt like a fresh start. I'd just gotten out of a messy breakup and needed space to breathe. The neighborhood was a small, sleepy suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone waved at each other while mowing their lawns and you could hear the train horn from a few towns over at night. I found a cozy little duplex on a quiet cul-de-sac, Unit 47B, and signed the lease immediately. My neighbor on the other side, 47A, was an older guy named Henry. At least, that's what the landlord told me. "Nice enough fella," she said, "keeps to himself. Bit odd, but harmless." That description didn't bother me. I wasn't looking for friends. I just wanted peace. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, worked from home, and took walks around the block. Henry didn't come out much. I'd see his lights flicker through the blinds sometimes, but the curtains were always drawn. Once, when I went to check the mail, I saw him from a distance. He was standing in his driveway, staring into the woods across the street, completely still, like he was watching something I couldn't see. He turned around suddenly, looked right at me, and gave a faint nod before going inside without a word. It should have been nothing, but there was something off about that look. Blank, cold, almost hollow. A few nights later, around 12:30 a.m., I heard a strange sound coming from the shared wall between our units. It wasn't music or TV, more like a muffled scraping. At first, I thought he might be rearranging furniture, but the noise didn't sound mechanical. It was slow, rhythmic, dragging. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a short, muffled yelp. Not loud, just enough to make my stomach twist. I sat up in bed and held my breath, listening. The sound came again, dragging, followed by a dull thud, then silence. I waited for it to start again, but it didn't. After maybe 15 minutes, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Thin walls, creaky pipes. It was an old building, after all. The next morning, I noticed something odd. There were wet spots on the shared driveway between our two units, dark reddish smears that trailed from his garage toward the back of his house. I bent down and touched one. It was sticky, faintly metallic smelling. I told myself it was just rust or maybe spilled oil. But when I looked closer, there were small clumps of dark hair stuck in it. That night, the scraping came again, longer this time. I turned off my TV and pressed my ear to the wall. There was a faint voice on the other side, a man's voice, muffled, monotone. He was saying something, but I couldn't make it out clearly. It sounded like he was talking to someone. Then, abruptly, there was a soft sob, a woman's voice. My blood went cold. I called out, "Hey, you okay over there?" Everything went silent. No scraping, no voices, nothing. I backed away from the wall, feeling my pulse in my throat. I barely slept that night, and when I left for work the next morning, Henry's car was gone. His garage door was open, though, and inside I saw something that made my stomach drop. A large tarp was laid out on the floor, and next to it was a big plastic container. Inside were tools, rusted saws, hammers, and rolls of duct tape. I told myself I was being paranoid. But when I got home later that evening, the tarp was gone, the garage closed, and the only sign that anything had been there was a faint reddish smear leading into the house. 2 days later, I ran into my mailman. He handed me my mail and said, "Weird thing about your neighbor. He hasn't picked up his mail in almost 2 weeks. Mind checking if he's all right?" 2 weeks? I asked, confused. "I saw him just the other day." The mailman frowned. "Nope, not since the end of last month. I'd have noticed." That didn't make sense. I'd seen Henry in the window 3 nights earlier, and last night I was sure I'd heard him talking to someone again. That night I decided to knock on his door. It was around 8 p.m. The porch light was off. The air smelled faintly of metal and rot. I knocked once, no answer. Knocked again, louder. Then slowly I heard footsteps inside, shuffling, uneven. The door creaked open about an inch, and I saw a sliver of darkness. "Henry?" I called. A man's voice came from inside, quiet but hoarse. "He's not here." I froze. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. Silence. Then the door clicked shut. I stepped back, heart pounding, and immediately called the landlord. She sounded annoyed when she picked up. "Look, I don't mean to bother you," I said, "but there's something strange going on next door. I think someone else might be living there." There was a pause. "What are you talking about?" she said. "Henry moved out 3 weeks ago. He didn't tell you?" "What?" "Yeah, he broke the lease early. Said he was moving to Indiana. Left the keys in the mailbox. Nobody's supposed to be in there." My mouth went dry. "Then who's in the house right now?" She hesitated. "What do you mean?" "I just heard someone talk," I said. "They said Henry's not here." She went quiet, then said she'd call the police to check it out. That night, 2 officers came by and knocked on Henry's door. They were there for maybe 10 minutes. I watched from my window as they talked to someone. I couldn't see who. Then they both walked away, laughing with each other, and drove off. I went out to ask what happened, but they were already gone. The next morning, when I opened my door to get the paper, there was a note taped to it. It was written in shaky handwriting. "Don't tell them. He gets angry." I nearly dropped it. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. I called the police again, but they said they'd already done a welfare check, and everything seemed fine. That night, around 1:15 a.m., I heard the scraping again, but this time it wasn't through the wall. It was coming from my back door. Something was dragging slowly across my porch. I turned off the lights and peeked through the blinds. The motion sensor light flicked on, revealing a tall figure standing just beyond the porch. It wasn't Henry. It was someone else. His clothes were filthy, his face hidden by the shadow of a hood. He was holding something heavy and dragging it behind him, a long black bag. He stopped, looked straight at my window, and smiled. I ducked down immediately, heart racing. A moment later, I heard him walking back toward the fence. The dragging stopped. Then, faintly, I heard a door open, Henry's back door, and then close. I didn't sleep at all after that. When morning came, I went outside to check the yard. There were faint drag marks across the grass leading toward his shed. The same shed I'd never seen open before. A thick, rusty padlock hung from the door. That was the day I decided to call in a favor from my cousin, who worked with the county sheriff's department. He agreed to come by that night, off the record, just to make sure I wasn't losing it. We got there around 9 p.m., just after sunset. I told him everything. He was skeptical, but agreed to take a look. We walked around the back of the duplex with flashlights. The shed loomed in the dark. As we got closer, the smell hit us, sweet, rotting, heavy. My cousin muttered, "Jesus Christ." He kicked at the lock, and it snapped off easily. When he opened the door, he stepped back so fast he nearly fell. Inside were rows of plastic containers, some sealed, some half open. The air reeked of decay, and there, against the far wall, was a shape covered in a dirty tarp. He pulled it back slowly. It was a mannequin. At least, that's what we thought at first, until we saw the hair. Real hair. Then the skin. It wasn't plastic. I gagged and stumbled backward. My cousin grabbed his radio, shouting for backup. Before he could finish the call, the motion light behind us clicked on. Someone was standing there, just outside the shed door. The man was tall, his face half hidden by shadow, his clothes soaked with dark stains. He smiled and said, "You shouldn't be here." My cousin drew his weapon and yelled for him to get down, but the man bolted toward the woods. We chased him for maybe 50 yards before he disappeared into the trees. The woods were dead silent after that. Police combed the area for hours, but he was gone. The body in the shed was confirmed to be Henry. The real Henry. The man I'd been hearing and seeing wasn't him. The coroner said he'd been dead for at least 3 weeks. Whoever was living there had been using Henry's house, his identity, even his car, and nobody noticed. The police found evidence of at least 2 other victims, buried in shallow graves near the tree line. I moved out that weekend. Sometimes when I'm alone late at night, I swear I still hear that scraping sound, the slow drag, the dull thud, like he's still out there somewhere, pulling another body across the floor. And once, a few months after moving, I found a note slipped under my door at my new place. No return address, just a single line written in that same shaky handwriting. "You shouldn't have told them." Story the end. When I first rented the small house on Brookfield Drive, I was just looking for a quiet place to get back on my feet. I'd been laid off from my job in Chicago, gone through a breakup, and needed to start fresh somewhere cheaper. The town was small, quiet, and safe, or so I thought. The house itself was modest, but perfect for one person. 2 bedrooms, a little backyard, and friendly neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. I met a few people when I moved in, but the one who stood out most was the woman next door. Her name was Marla. Marla looked to be in her late 40s, thin, with sharp cheekbones and dark circles under her eyes. She lived alone, rarely came outside, except to smoke on her porch late at night. The first time I met her, she smiled faintly and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. It gets quiet here after dark. You'll get used to it." I didn't think much of it at the time, but something in the way she said it stayed with me. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. I settled into my new routine, found a part-time job at the hardware store downtown, and started sleeping better than I had in months. But every night around midnight, I'd notice strange noises from Marla's house. Sometimes it sounded like faint talking, like she was having a conversation with someone. Other times it was soft thumping, rhythmic, like footsteps pacing from one end of her living room to the other. One night, I went to take the trash out and saw that her living room light was flickering. Through the thin curtains, I could see her silhouette standing perfectly still, facing the window. I raised my hand to wave, but she didn't move. She just stood there. After a few seconds, the light went out. The next morning, I saw her outside for the first time in daylight. She was watering her plants, wearing the same faded housecoat I'd seen through the window. I tried to make small talk, asking if she'd just moved in, but she said quietly, "No, I've been here a long time. People come and go, but I stay." That struck me as strange. A week later, I woke to knocking. It wasn't on my door. It was coming from the wall between my bedroom and hers. I sat up in the dark, listening. The knocks were slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall. On the other side, I could hear faint breathing. I whispered, "Marla?" No answer. I tried to sleep, but the knocking went on for nearly half an hour before stopping completely. The next day, when I saw her outside, I mentioned it casually. "Hey, did you happen to hear knocking last night? It sounded like it was coming from the wall between our houses." She gave me a long, unreadable look and said, "It wasn't me. It's the one who doesn't like noise." Then she turned and went inside. That sentence echoed in my head all day. Later that night, I woke again around 12:45. This time, I heard something different, a dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the floor. I held my breath. Then I heard muffled voices. I couldn't make out the words, but there were definitely 2 people. I thought maybe Marla had a guest, but when I peeked out my window, her house was dark. Completely dark. I told myself it was just her TV, maybe playing low through the walls. But the next morning, I saw her leaving her house with an empty stare, her face pale and drawn. Her front door was still cracked open behind her, and inside the lights were off. That night, the knocking came again. Louder this time. I recorded it on my phone, 6 distinct knocks, followed by a dragging noise, then silence. I texted the landlord and told him about it. He said, "That's weird. Nobody's lived in that unit for years." I froze. I texted back, "What do you mean? The woman next door, Marla, she lives there." He replied almost immediately, "No one's lived there since 2018. The last tenant was an older woman named Marla who, well, it's complicated. She died in that house." I felt my hands go cold. I didn't even reply. The next morning, I walked next door and knocked on her door. No answer. I looked through the window, curtains drawn, dust on the glass. The house looked abandoned. I walked around back and saw that her yard was overgrown, the patio furniture rusted and falling apart. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I went back inside and sat on my couch, trying to process it. Maybe the landlord had the wrong house, I thought. Maybe there had been another Marla before this one. But when I checked online, I found an old article from 2018 about a woman named Marla who had been found dead inside her home on Brookfield Drive. The picture was unmistakable. It was her. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard the dragging again. Then a whisper. My name. It was faint, like someone calling from the other side of the wall. I tried to ignore it, but the whispering grew louder, turning into a raspy voice saying, "You shouldn't have come here." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. Just static. Then the lights flickered and my living room went completely dark. From the window, I saw movement. A figure was standing on Marla's porch, the same silhouette I'd seen before. Only this time she wasn't still. She was rocking slowly back and forth. I couldn't see her face, just the outline of her thin body in the porch light. Then I heard footsteps inside my house, slow, coming from the kitchen. I turned on my phone's flashlight and crept toward the sound. The air was cold, my breath visible. When I reached the kitchen, the back door was wide open. I could see the outline of bare footprints leading from the door to the hallway that led to my bedroom. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. I heard the faint sound of humming, an old song, familiar but distant. It was coming from my bedroom. I took one step closer, then another. When I reached the doorway, my phone light flickered over something that made my blood run cold. Someone was standing in the corner, facing the wall. The same faded housecoat, the same matted hair. Slowly, the figure turned its head. It was Marla. Her eyes were sunken, skin pale and gray, her mouth slightly open as if she were trying to speak. I stumbled back and dropped the phone. The flashlight spun across the floor, catching a glimpse of her bare feet, dirty, cracked, smeared with what looked like mud or dried blood. I scrambled for the door, but she moved fast, faster than I thought possible. Her hand caught my arm, freezing cold and rough. I screamed and yanked away, running out into the night barefoot, straight to my car. I didn't stop driving until I was 20 miles away. The police went to check the house the next day. They found my door open, but said there was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no fingerprints. The house next door, they said, had been locked up for years. No one inside. They found nothing but dust cobwebs, and furniture covered in sheets. I never went back. I left my things, my deposit, everything. A few weeks later, I got a call from the landlord. He said the new tenants had complained about knocking at night. Strange, right? He said. They said it's coming from your old side. I didn't respond. I just hung up. Sometimes late at night in my new apartment, I swear I still hear faint knocking through the walls, always 3 times. Then silence, and sometimes just before I fall asleep, I hear a low voice whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." Story, the end. When I first moved to the quiet cul-de-sac in Springfield, Illinois, I thought I'd finally found peace. I'd been through a rough divorce and needed a place that didn't remind me of anyone but myself. The neighborhood was peaceful. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, well-kept lawns. My little 2-bedroom rental sat at the end of the street, and the first thing I noticed was how close the houses were, especially the one to my right. The place next door looked almost identical to mine, except for one detail. The windows were always covered. Every single one. Heavy dark curtains that never parted, not even during the day. The real estate agent told me an older man lived there. Mr. Anderson, retired, quiet, mostly keeps to himself. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for friends. For the first couple of weeks, everything was normal. I worked during the day as an insurance adjuster and spent my nights cooking simple meals, watching TV, and slowly unpacking boxes I'd barely touched since the move. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement from next door. A shadow behind the curtains, the sound of a TV faintly playing through the wall. One night, about a month in, I got home late after meeting a client. As I parked, I noticed Mr. Anderson's porch light flickering on and off, almost like a signal. I figured it was just a wiring issue, but it caught my attention enough that I slowed down and looked toward his house. In the dim glow, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There was someone standing in his front window. Not an old man, though. It was a young woman, long hair, thin arms pressed against the glass like she was trying to see out. When she noticed me looking, she backed away quickly, disappearing behind the curtains. I sat there for a few seconds before shaking it off. Maybe a family member was visiting. Maybe he had a caretaker or nurse. But over the next few nights, I saw her again, always at the same time, always standing by that same window, staring out into the street. It wasn't until one night when I heard knocking that things started to truly feel wrong. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I first heard it, soft, steady knocks from somewhere near the shared side of the house. I muted my TV and listened. 3 knocks, silence, then 3 more. I stood and went to the wall, pressing my ear against the drywall. That's when I heard it, a voice, low and shaky. "Help me." My body went cold. It was definitely a woman's voice. I stepped back, heart pounding. It came again, barely audible. "Please, help me." I didn't know what to do. I went to the window and peeked outside. His house was dark, except for a dim light coming from one of the back rooms. I grabbed my phone, debated calling 911, but I hesitated. What if it was just a TV? Maybe the sound carried weird through the wall. I told myself I was overreacting. The next day, I saw Mr. Anderson for the first time. He was out in his driveway, pulling weeds. He was older, mid-60s maybe, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. His face was thin, but his smile was polite. "Morning," I said cautiously. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. "Morning, neighbor. Settling in all right?" "Yeah, pretty well," I said. Then, trying to sound casual, I added, "Hey, I thought I heard something strange last night. Sounded like someone talking through the wall." His expression didn't change. "Old houses," he said simply, "make all sorts of noises. You'll get used to it." Then he went back to pulling weeds. I let it go, but the knocking didn't stop. It happened again the next night and the night after that, always between 11 and midnight. Sometimes it was just faint knocking. Sometimes it was whispering. "Please, help me." Finally, one Friday, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. Around 11:15, when the house next door went dark, I slipped outside and walked to the narrow space between our homes. His backyard was overgrown, the grass tall and uneven. I circled around to where I'd seen the dim light before, one small window near the ground, like a basement window. The curtain wasn't drawn all the way. I crouched down and peered inside. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw her. The same young woman I'd seen in the front window, sitting on the floor of a bare room. Her wrists were bound with rope. She looked right at me. "Please," she whispered, "get me out." I stumbled backward, nearly falling. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I bolted back inside my house and called 911. I told them everything: my neighbor, the knocking, the woman in the basement. They told me to stay inside and wait for an officer. It felt like an eternity, but within 10 minutes, flashing lights filled the street. I watched from my window as two officers knocked on his door. He answered quickly, calm, even smiling. I couldn't hear what they said, but after a few minutes of talking, one of the officers nodded, and they all stepped inside. 10 minutes later, they came back out, alone. They talked to each other for a moment, then one of them came over to my house. "Sir," he said, "we checked the property. There's no one there." "What? That's impossible," I stammered. "I saw her through the window," he sighed. "The basement's locked off, just storage. Mr. Anderson showed us. There's no sign of anyone else living there." I tried to protest, but it was clear he didn't believe me. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, the knocking came again, louder this time. "Please," the voice whispered. "He knows you saw me." I jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the house. Then I heard something new, a dragging sound, coming from under the floorboards. It moved from the wall to the center of the living room. Slow, scraping, heavy. And then, faintly, I heard her voice again. "He's watching you." The next morning, I noticed something I hadn't before. A vent near the floor of my living room, right where I'd heard the dragging sound. It wasn't connected to my HVAC system. It looked different. Old. Curious and terrified, I knelt down and shined my phone flashlight into it. It was a tunnel, a narrow crawl space that extended under both houses, and deep inside, something glinted in the light. A piece of jewelry, a silver bracelet. I reached in as far as I could, but it was too deep. That evening, I called the police again and told them what I'd found. This time, they sent two different officers. I showed them the vent, and one of them decided to check it out. He pried off the grate and crawled partway in with his flashlight. A few seconds later, I heard him gasp. "Call for backup," he said. They ended up pulling out two plastic garbage bags. Inside were bones, human bones. The coroner later confirmed they belonged to a woman in her 20s. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. The remains were old, at least 6 or 7 years. They arrested Mr. Anderson the next day. I watched from my window as they let him out in handcuffs. His expression was still calm, almost smug. As they put him in the cruiser, he looked right at my house and smiled. "You shouldn't have looked," he said. It turned out he'd been married once, to a woman named Emily. She'd gone missing 8 years ago. The police had never found her. They found traces of her blood in the basement. After his arrest, the knocking stopped. For a while, I tried to move on. But even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes at 11:30 to faint tapping on my wall and a soft voice whispering, "Please, help me." Story the end. When I first moved into the small rental house on the corner of Chestnut Drive, it seemed perfect for what I needed. A quiet, affordable place close to work, far away from the chaos of the city. It was early autumn, the leaves just starting to turn, and the little suburban neighborhood looked peaceful. The houses were modest, spaced close enough for neighbors to wave across driveways, but not so close that you felt crowded. It seemed like the kind of place where people minded their own business. I'd just gotten out of a messy breakup and was looking for something simple, normal. The house itself was a one-story with pale blue siding, a small fenced backyard, and an old oak tree shading the front porch. It had been empty for a while, according to the landlord, who lived 2 towns over. He said the previous tenant, a middle-aged man named Russell, had left suddenly in the middle of the night, leaving some furniture behind. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. People move for all kinds of reasons. The first few days were quiet. I worked long hours, came home, made frozen dinners, and went to bed. My only interaction with anyone was with the woman next door. Her name was Marlene, probably in her early 60s, short with curly silver hair, always wearing a faded pink robe when she watered her flowers in the morning. The first time I saw her, she waved at me and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood," in a voice that was almost too cheery. I thanked her and waved back, thinking she was just a friendly neighbor. But Marlene wasn't alone in her house. On the second night, while I was taking the trash out, I saw a man standing in her window. He was tall, thin, and pale. his face pressed close to the glass like he was trying to see outside without being seen. I waved awkwardly, but he didn't move. I thought maybe it was her husband. When I asked her about him the next morning, she smiled and said, "Oh, that's just my brother. He's not well. Stays inside most of the time." I didn't think much of it, but something about her tone felt off, like she wanted to end the conversation fast. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. Late at night, I'd hear faint tapping on my bedroom wall, the one that faced her house. At first, I thought it might be branches scraping in the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Then another faint tap. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, it was always around 2 or 3 in the morning. One night, I got out of bed and stood by the window. Marlene's house was dark except for a dim yellow light in one of the upstairs rooms. I could see movement behind the curtains, a shadow passing back and forth. I figured it was her or her brother pacing around. Still, the tapping didn't stop. I knocked on the wall once, hard, half-jokingly, to signal back. The tapping stopped. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, came 3 slow, heavier knocks from her side. I stepped back, my chest tightening. I told myself it was probably just pipes or the house settling. Old houses do weird things. But after that, I couldn't get back to sleep. The next morning, I saw Marlene in her yard again, clipping her roses. I asked casually if everything was okay next door, if maybe her brother needed help with something. Her smile faded slightly. "You shouldn't worry about him," she said quietly. "He's not supposed to bother anyone." "Supposed to?" I asked. She looked up, her expression blank for a moment before she forced another smile. "You're new here. You'll get used to the sounds. Old houses carry noises. That's all." Then she turned back to her flowers like the conversation was over. By October, I'd started working later shifts, getting home around 10 or 11 at night. That's when I began to notice a smell around my side yard, a sickly, sour odor, like something wet and rotting. I checked the trash cans, even looked under the porch, but found nothing. It seemed to be coming from somewhere near the fence line between our properties. One night, I heard voices through the open kitchen window. Marlene's voice, low and hurried, and another one, a man's, whispery and strained, like it hurt him to talk. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a definite argument happening. Then a thump. Then silence. I stood frozen by the window for several minutes before I finally turned on the TV to drown it out. A few days later, I came home and noticed something odd. My back gate was open. I always locked it. Always. It swung lightly in the wind, creaking, and the smell was worse now, strong enough to make me gag. I followed it to the corner of the fence and saw that some of the boards had been pushed out from the other side, like someone had tried to crawl through. The dirt beneath was disturbed, clawed at, almost. I knocked on Marlene's door that evening. She opened it just a crack, enough for me to see her eyes, wide, red, tired. "Yes?" she said softly. "Hey, sorry to bother you, but my gate was open again, and I think maybe someone's been in my yard. You haven't seen anyone around, have you?" Her expression flickered. "No one comes here," she said flatly. Then she leaned forward and whispered, "If you hear him again, don't answer." I froze. "What?" She shut the door before I could say another word. That night, I locked every door and window. I left a lamp on in the living room, sat on the couch, and tried to watch something mindless just to relax. Around midnight, I started to doze off. Then came the sound. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, heart racing. The sound was louder now, coming from the side of the house near the kitchen. I stood and walked over slowly, my bare feet cold against the floor. The tapping continued. 3 quick knocks, then silence. I pulled the curtain back just a little. Someone was standing by the fence. A man. The same man I'd seen in Marlene's window that first night. His skin looked grayish under the porch light, his clothes damp, his shoulders slumped. He was facing my house directly, and while his eyes fixed on my window, I froze, not daring to breathe. After a long moment, he tilted his head like a curious dog and lifted his hand. He waved. I stumbled backward and ran for the phone. When I came back to the window seconds later, he was gone. The police came but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. They told me it was probably a trespasser or a vagrant passing through. "You'd be surprised how often that happens," one of the officers said. After that night, the noises stopped for a while. I even started to think maybe I'd imagined how strange it all had been. Marlene stopped coming outside, though. Her blinds stayed shut all the time. Her house looked empty. Then, about 2 weeks later, I woke up to a loud banging at my front door. It was 3 a.m. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't move. The banging came again, harder this time. "Help me!" It was Marlene's voice. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the door. She was standing on the porch in her robe, her eyes wild, her hands trembling. "He's out," she whispered. "He got out." Before I could ask what she meant, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Lock everything. Don't open your windows. Don't let him in, no matter what he says." Then she let go and ran back toward her house. I stood there, completely stunned. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, there were police cars outside her house. I saw them carrying out a stretcher covered with a black sheet. One of the officers came to talk to me later. He said they'd found Marlene collapsed in her hallway. Natural causes, they thought. Heart attack. I told him about the man I'd seen, about the tapping, about how she said her brother wasn't well. He looked at me like he didn't quite believe me, but humored me anyway. Then he said something that still makes my stomach twist when I think about it. "Ma'am, there wasn't anyone else in that house. No sign of anyone living there but her. No second toothbrush, no clothes, no prescriptions. Nothing." I insisted I'd seen him, but he just nodded and made a note in his book. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. I sat by the window, staring at her darkened house. For the first time, I noticed how one of the upstairs windows was boarded from the inside. Around 2 a.m., something moved in that window. Just a flicker, like someone pacing back and forth. I blinked hard, thinking it was just my imagination. Then I saw it again. Thin. A figure. Tall. Thin. Standing perfectly still, staring down at my house. The next day, I called my landlord and told him I wanted out of the lease. I didn't care about losing the deposit. He didn't even seem surprised. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That place has had issues." "What kind of issues?" I asked. He sighed. "The guy who lived there before you, Russell, he used to complain about the same thing. Said the woman next door had someone staying with her. Said he'd hear knocking, see someone outside at night. Then one day he just up and left. Never came back for his things." I moved out within the week, but sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night and hear faint tapping sounds against my bedroom wall. Not loud enough to be certain it's real, but just enough to make me hold my breath. And every time I remind myself of what Marlene said before she died. Don't answer. Story the end. When I first moved into the duplex on Maple Avenue, it was the cheapest, decent place I could find. I just relocated for a new job in Ohio, trying to get my feet under me after a breakup and a string of bad luck. The unit was small but clean, 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a fenced backyard. The other half of the duplex was occupied already, though when I first signed the lease, the landlord didn't say much about the tenant next door. "Quiet guy," was all he told me. "Keeps to himself. You'll hardly notice he's there." That sounded perfect to me. The first few weeks went smoothly enough. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly older people who'd lived there for decades. I didn't see my neighbor much at all, but I'd hear him sometimes. Late at night, I'd catch muffled footsteps or the low sound of something dragging across the floor. I assumed it was furniture or maybe a dog. The first time I saw him, I was taking my trash cans out to the curb one evening. He was standing in his driveway, just staring up at the sky. He was maybe in his late 30s, tall and thin with short, dark hair. When I said hello, he startled a little, like he hadn't realized I was there. "Oh," he said softly. "Hey." I introduced myself. He said his name was Scott. There was something off about him, though I couldn't put my finger on it. His voice was calm but distant, like he wasn't all there. His eyes lingered a few seconds too long when he looked at me. He smiled, but only with his mouth. His eyes stayed flat and cold. After that, he didn't make much of an effort to talk, but I'd see him occasionally. Once, he was outside at 3 a.m., kneeling by his side of the fence, digging into the dirt with a small shovel. Another time, I caught him standing at his kitchen window, the blinds open, just watching my side of the duplex. When he realized I could see him, he quickly closed them. I started keeping my curtains drawn after that. Then the noises began. It started as soft knocking on the shared wall between our living rooms, faint, rhythmic, and always around midnight. At first, I thought maybe he was just hanging something up or doing work. But the knocks came night after night, always around the same time, and they got louder. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, patterned. I tried knocking back once just to see if he'd stop. He didn't. Instead, he paused for a few seconds and then started again, harder. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask him about it the next day, he smiled strangely and said, "You hear it too?" I didn't know how to respond. He laughed softly to himself, like it was some private joke. "Yeah," he said. "It's under the floor sometimes. You'll get used to it." Under the floor? I asked him what he meant, but he just waved his hand and went back inside. That night, I didn't sleep. Every little sound put me on edge. Around 1 a.m., the knocking came again, but this time it wasn't from the wall. It was coming from beneath my bedroom floor. It was faint at first, like tapping with a stick, but soon it grew louder, more frantic, as if something was pounding to get out. I froze. The sound went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped completely. The next morning, I checked the crawl space under the duplex. There wasn't much down there, just pipes, insulation, and dirt. No signs of animals or anything that could have made that noise. But I noticed something weird. On Scott's side, near where the wall divided our units, the dirt was disturbed, like someone had been digging. A few days later, a police cruiser showed up next door. 2 officers went inside Scott's unit and stayed for about 20 minutes before leaving. I watched from behind my blinds but didn't see Scott come out. When I finally saw him later that night, he was dragging a large black trash bag to the bins out back. The bag was heavy. I could tell by the way he struggled to lift it into the can. The next morning, the trash was gone before the collectors arrived. That night, the knocking started again. I called the landlord the following morning and told him about the noises, about Scott's strange behavior, and asked if there was any history with the unit. He sighed heavily before saying, "Scott's been there a while. His brother used to live with him. Passed away about 2 years ago. Heart attack, supposedly. He's been different since then." When I asked if the death happened in the house, he paused before answering, "Yeah, in the other unit." I tried to brush it off as coincidence, but things kept escalating. I'd hear faint whispers through the wall now, not just knocking, a voice murmuring low, indecipherable words. Sometimes I'd hear it when I was half asleep and couldn't tell if it was real or a dream. One evening, I came home from work to find my front door slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it. My stomach dropped. I slowly pushed it open, my heart pounding, and checked each room. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing stolen. No signs of forced entry. But when I got to my bedroom, something on the wall made my blood run cold. There were faint smudges on the paint, like someone had pressed their hand flat against it over and over. The prints were slightly darker than the wall, almost oily. They weren't mine. That night, I slept with my bedroom door locked. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my doorknob rattling. Slow, deliberate. Then a quiet whisper right outside the door. "They won't stay quiet." I sat frozen, gripping my phone, too terrified to move. I called 911, whispering into the receiver. By the time officers arrived, whoever had been at my door was gone. They checked both units but found no one in Scott's. He wasn't home, and his car wasn't in the driveway. 2 days later, I ran into Martha, the older lady who lived down the street. She asked if I'd heard the news. A jogger had found a body in the woods about half a mile away. The police were investigating. I didn't ask questions. That night, I woke up to a scraping sound outside my bedroom window. I crept over and slowly peeked out through the blinds. Scott was standing there, his face inches from the glass, staring right at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth was twitching like he was trying not to laugh. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp, and by the time I looked again, he was gone. I called the police again. They searched the area but didn't find him. They told me to keep my doors locked and call immediately if he returned. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on my porch, bare feet again, leading from the side of his duplex to my door. That was enough. I packed a few things and went to stay at a friend's place across town. I called my landlord the next day to tell him I was leaving. He didn't argue. He just said quietly, "You're not the first." A week later, after I'd moved out, I got a call from that same friend. She'd seen something on the local news. Police had finally entered Scott's unit after reports of a foul smell. Inside, they found several large holes dug into the crawlspace floor, each containing plastic bags with remains. Scott was gone. They never found him. And the police confirmed later that the body found in the woods, the one the jogger stumbled across, was the landlord's missing maintenance man, who hadn't been seen since spring. I sometimes wonder if Scott ever came back to the house. If maybe he still lives nearby, staying quiet until someone new moves in next door. And when I think back to those nights of knocking, always in threes, always after midnight, I realize something that still keeps me awake. The knocks weren't random. They were coming from my side of the wall, too. Story the end.